I can't really do justice to by rambling through it. So if you go ahead and introduce yourself, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Grant. I really appreciate it. I want to start off by thanking Sebastian for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. It's, oftentimes we don't get to talk about a lot about logistics and wargaming. So I see this as a real opportunity to talk to the broader community and sort of maybe convert some people over to my point of view. While this is the same talk that I gave to the Military Operations Research Society's Community of Practice back on the 1st of July, I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to have a little bit more simple interaction and to field questions more directly from people during the talk. As Grant mentioned, I can't see the chat window on my display right now. So if you send things to him in the chat, he can then bring it to my attention, and I'm happy to stop in the middle and talk about things that are amplifying specific concepts that I'm going over. I really would like to make this as interactive as possible. And obviously, if it's a very complex question, I might want to table it to the end so that we can really give it due justice and really spend some time on it. The initial topic that I wrote to talk about was actually had two pieces to it. The first is to talk about including logistics in war games, and the other part of it then was about wargaming logistics. And these two differ widely in some of the details, but given the imprimatur, I'm going to kind of reach out and try to embrace both of them at the same time. As I talk, I'm going to kind of flip freely between the two sides of it. Hopefully, as I do that, it'll be pretty clear which one I'm trying to refer to at that moment. But if not, like I said, please let Grant know, and I'll try to provide clarification in the moment that are there. So without further ado, I'm going to sort of plunge ahead, and hopefully I will not screw up the technical aspects of this, and we'll have a great talk. So here we go. Most wargaming talks or talks about wargaming usually begin with a discussion of the definition of a wargame. I'm not going to. And for two reasons. The first is that I think that the definition of a wargame and how we think about what constitutes a wargame is an incredibly interesting topic in and of itself, and something that I would want to dedicate a significant amount of time to, at the very least an entire hour, to talking about exactly what a wargame is. Perhaps sometime I'll get the chance to come back. We'll see. And I think that it's a very important thing, because I think a lot of things get called war games which actually aren't war games, and that can lead to real problems, particularly as we're trying to do this in a professional mode. Someone says, well, that's a war game, and you know in your heart that it actually isn't. The other reason that I'm not going to spend too much time on defining what a war game is because, unfortunately, a lot of times the definitions end up sort of kind of going off in very disparate directions. A lot of times they're sort of like the Monty Python Live at the Hollywood Bowl, where it's the 50-yard dash with those with no sense of direction. The gun goes off and everybody scatters. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to give a very broad sort of enveloping definition of a war game and kind of use that as the umbrella under which I'm going to work. And so my definition for the purposes of this talk is that a war game is a virtual environment where the participants are engaging with a problem of interest to them. And that's it. I'm not going to go into any details about everything else of that other than what I talked about in the talk. But so I'm going to use that as sort of my starting point for things. So moving to the next one. Here's a very brief outline of what I'd like to talk about. So I want to begin with the motivation of why you should include logistics in war games at all. And I think this is an important part because, as I'll get to at the very end, when I start talking about the execution, a lot of times in some sense we have to almost justify why it is that we're including war games as part of we're including logistics as part of our war game. I think that that's an important sort of, it's important to have the ability to sort of debate and argue that and present the reasoning for why it is that you should be doing logistics in the first place. After I talk about that for a few slides, then what I'd like to do is kind of move into how you implement logistics into war games in terms of the development and design aspect of things. How is it that you, kind of the tricks of the trade, things that I found that worked for me when I built logistics war games, stuff that I found failed, and show out some of the pitfalls that are out there as well. And from there, I'd then like to talk a little bit about the execution when you run a logistics war game, and talk about some of the things that I've learned in terms of the practical aspects on the ground when you're dealing with the players and participants and how they engage with you and things that can go really badly. And I'd like to sort of, at the very end, talk very briefly about what I think it's sort of the way forward is for the future, for wargaming, logistics in specific, but also in general, and just in terms of, what I think that wargames should probably be trying to do as we go into the future. So with that said, I'm going to throw down my intellectual gauntlet and begin with this comment here. I think that if your wargame does not have logistics in it, you're just doing it for fun. I've seen a lot of wargames that don't have meaningful inclusions of logistics in them. And frankly, I think they would have been better served if they pulled out a board of Risk and played a game with that. I think that having logistics incorporated in things, particularly if you're doing a serious question, you're trying to, you're building a professional war game, that it's really, having logistics as part of what you're doing is an absolutely critical aspect of the construction, the design, and development. Here's why. Logistics in general are kind of this weird sort of thing that kind of lives in everyone's blind spot. People don't do it mostly because I think that they think it's either too hard or sometimes because they think it's too boring. And the problem is that it falls into what Douglas Adams would have called an SCP field, somebody else's problem. It is a thing then where you have the situation that you are conducting an operation within your war game. You're testing out some concept of employment or a technical capability or things like that. And you're just kind of putting the whole logistics aspect of it over into, well, somebody else will do that and take care of it. Now I don't need to worry about that. And that actually can really lead to really significant problems. I mean, as the picture here suggests, you can have this situation where people are very happily standing there where this thing that can actually just completely kill them if it just turns and glances their way is right next door to them. And they've just kind of turned a blind eye because it's not their problem. I think that can lead to real significant issues and real problems. I would also argue that this condition, the idea that logistics becomes somebody else's problem, is not limited just to the people doing kinetics, the operations officers out there. This is something that everyone, in my experience, has been vulnerable to, even logisticians. Specifically, what often occurs is the situation where the logisticians are looking at things, well, that part of logistics is something that somebody else will do. Situations where, for example, the fuelie who's purchasing fuel on the open market doesn't think that they should have to worry about where the tankers come from or where the additives to convert that fuel into military spec are going to come from either. So I think that this is something that is not, logistics are hard. And the problem of doing them is complicated and it has a lot of things associated with it. And a lot of people simply just don't want to deal with it. And so they kind of put it out of the way and they just kind of push it off. I think that the part then that comes in, which is then what trips everyone up, is that logistics are a critical aspect of war games and how they're run and thus their design, because they represent constraints. They are situations in which you have to have enough fuel to make your jets go from point A to point B. And if you don't, well, then they can't fly that distance. Without meaningful logistics, you get this whole host of things where silly things can occur. And I can tell you that I've seen every single one of these little these are done somewhat a little flippantly, but I've seen every single one of these things been implemented within a game, a professional game, where someone has been doing things, something where suddenly cargo ships just move around the board because, well, they just get there, because the person needs them to be there to make the things go. That creates a lot of real problems because if you don't have logistics in, you're just basically using fairy dust and magical thinking. So the common set of terms that are used within the logistical community, where they talk about how the issues that they're grappling with are just fairy dusted over. And I would argue that insisting to the general staff, to the boss, if you will, that having a meaningful logistics in a game, this is the hill that we as designers and developers should be willing to die on. This is the thing that we as designers and developers should be willing to walk away from a game design because the person isn't putting them in there or isn't allowing us to put it in there. And here's why. putting aside the fact that if you design a game that is, doesn't have meaningful logistics in it, that the entire logistical community will line up to take a well-aimed potshot at your work. Putting that aside for the moment. The results that you derive from your logistics agnostic work may lead to someone taking on a particular course of action because they've done a poor estimation of risk, and this could lead to someone actually dying. And that's a real problem, because at the very bottom line, our job as defense analysts and as people who are building professional war games is to help the decision makers make fully informed, intelligent choices so that we can save lives. And that's a really, I take that charge very, very seriously when I'm building games, is that, you know, this needs to be something that we are actually putting some content to, because absent that, like I said, you're going to create some real problems downstream as people move forward with what you've been working on. So, on to design and developing. Hopefully I've made my case that this is an important thing to do. I then sort of want to back away from sort of how, you know, this is now the velvet glove around the iron fist, if you will. And that is the resolution of this problem comes in by using the word meaningful. And I think that I put that word in there because it's intentionally slippery. It allows for a fairly broad interpretation of things, because I think that you can add meaningful logistics in a whole host of different ways. So for example, if you have a game with logistics, it's not about logistics, but it's with logistics, you can put in the logistics aspect of it by incorporating things like access to supply lines, towns, railroads, ports, airfields. You can put it in by saying things like going, okay, well, you don't have the infinite magazine within your pistol or within your destroyer. You can put in effects that say like, okay, well, when you go into a situation where you're out of supply, whatever that means, that you got degraded performance of your unit. You can also have mandatory resupply events. Very simple mechanisms that you can put into the game flow that the players, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the players can sort of go like, oh yeah, I got to do the logistics part, but it kind of reminds them and keeps it going in. When you're talking about games about logistics, in those games, what you're talking about there is more things about distribution networks, accessibility to markets, production capacities, whether or not this refinery has enough to produce what you need. And it's also important to put in and to highlight that there are potential vulnerabilities, or at least there's the access to vulnerabilities on the part of the adversary. The red is able to reach out and touch blue in a way that is meaningful and has, you know, implications that blue then has to address. I think that the most important part of parsing this word meaningful is making sure that the question that the command is trying to address is what drives the process. If the command is most interested in understanding the distribution network and building that on the fly in a period and an epoch of conflict, well, then that should be what you should be focusing things in on. You don't need to worry about whether or not there's enough fuel. You don't need to worry about whether or not the refineries can ramp up enough or not. But you need to sort of talk about those things. If you're talking about things like, well, you're worried about whether or not, what happens if a tactical unit moving on the ground, if they've done this many operations in a row, then they're starting to run out of low on ammo. How will that then sort of degrade their ability to sort of interact with other units, other adversaries around them? Those are the aspects of what it is you need to be doing, but those should all be driven by the question. I think that looking at the question and letting that be the thing that sort of dictates what you do can help you sort of cleave away all the clutter that can oftentimes kind of glom onto games, particularly just games about logistics or games with logistics. So what is the focus of the question? In war games about logistics, and this is one thing that our sponsors trip over quite a bit, they often get wrapped around the axle about the scenario. I would argue that in a war game about logistics, the scenario is essentially useless. It's irrelevant. At one game I designed for one sponsor, the person turned to me at one point and very intelligently said, I don't care what the scenario is. It could be Martians invading New Jersey. I just need to test this one thing. And he was clear on what he needed to do. And so we were able to manage that aspect of things. A lot of times people will say, well, this scenario is unrealistic because it doesn't fit with the O plan. Or this scenario could never happen because that person would never behave in this way. it doesn't matter. What matters is whether or not you're actually testing the phenomenon that is of importance to what you're trying to do. So in some sense, when you're doing a war game about logistics, you have a fairly free hand about how you write the scenario up. Alternatively, in war games with logistics, scenario is everything. So the scenario is going to be driving sort of the constraints of things. You're going to need to figure out how to weave things into that. In war games about logistics, a lot of times I think people get wrapped up in the idea of making sure that they have enough. I think that this is actually usually a useless endeavor because, take, for example, fuel. In most contexts, there is more than enough jet aviation fuel scattered around the globe to do whatever it is that you want to do within any size military conflict. The consumption rate of fuel by military vehicles and aircraft is a small percentage of what the overall world supply can produce and has on stock at any one point in time. So the idea of is there enough in the world? The answer is yes, there is. Now, whether that fuel is in the right place at the right time, that is a question that can be very much open for debate. So I would argue that in war games about logistics, what you're trying to look for as you're doing the design and development is you're looking for pressure points, places where each side can kind of push on the other to sort of affect their choices and degrade or manipulate or divert the actions of their opponent and their adversary. This makes sure that you're not just getting them to trying to grapple with the time distance problem, because frankly, that's just boring as heck. The idea that all that they're going to focus on is whether or not they can make their ship go faster from point A to point B than they would under normal circumstances, that's not a very interesting problem. In addition, in war games about logistics, you don't want this just to be a thing of where they're spending all their time counting everything up. I call it the accounting game. I got to tell you, even accountants don't want to play the accounting game. So don't let yourself slide into those moments where the sponsor or the people, the other interested actors within the process of the design development they're making you spend all of your time designing or writing the scenario out, or they're trying to make you focus in on things that seem to be not really particularly relevant. Like they're trying to make sure that you've stacked up everything and they can count exactly how many pallets of whatever it is that they're talking about in one particular place or not. Again, you're trying to look for the pressure points and things like that. Flipping over to games where it's a war game, but it's about logistics. The important aspect of when you're doing that is to try to make sure that you have a sensible and logical representation that constrains the players in a meaningful way, but that can be resolved fairly quickly so that they can do their logistics aspect of things. They can keep themselves sort of bound to stuff very tethered to reality nicely, but it doesn't sort of be the thing that derives everything. I saw a wonderful mechanism in a class that Sebastian and I were in the other day. It was within Sam Strike, Phil Sabin's game. And one of the really interesting things that he had in there was he had a point at the very beginning where the players had to decide how to allocate a finite number of weapons to all their aircraft. Well, that led to some very interesting situations where all of one particular kind of ordnance was expended fairly quickly. Well, that means you can't use anymore because it's gone. So it was an interesting way to put the constraints into a problem like that. And I think that can be something that we can look at and very quickly put in that makes it so that the players aren't just sitting there, it's like the bad cop movie where the guy sits there just blasting away with his 6-shot pistol and never reloading, even though they shot hundreds and hundreds of rounds. That's clearly not realistic. And when we're trying to do something, we're saying like, okay, well, at this point you need to reload. Well, okay, that's going to then sort of change the shape and course of what the events that are going on. Specifically, with respect to that, then what matters then in war games with logistics is the time scale. What kind of time plan are we playing over? Is this an engagement that's going to take place over 10 minutes? Is this an engagement that's going to take place over 10 weeks? And sort of understanding that time scale can really help you sort of look at what the logistics aspects of things need to be. Here's why. A lot of times people will say, oh, well, the logistics will just happen in between turns. And okay, sure, I'm willing to kind of play along with that. There are, however, a whole bunch of what I would call the re's, refuel, rearm, repair, reconstitute, and rest. So if we're going to have a game turn that is 10 days long, Yeah, I buy it that a pilot could be rested and be able to do an operation after a 10-day time period. That seems totally reasonable to me. But what if your game turn is 4 hours? I don't buy that a pilot's going to be able to fly a sortie, come back, be rested, and then go fly a sortie on the next game turn. That's not realistic as far as I'm concerned. So you need to kind of look at what it is you're talking about. If you're doing something with, there's a short time scale in terms of your OODA loop process that's going on, where the each turn is, say, 12 hours in length. You can't have a squadron send out a full sortie of all its aircraft every single turn. They're going to need to rest. They're going to have planning cycles. They're going to have assessment cycles. They're going to need repair. They're going to need rearming. So having that means that you're going to have a degraded capability to put things forward, because you need to put the logistics aspects and things. It's also important to remember that the logistics heartbeats, like it says here in my bumper sticker, they're really long. So the time process of burning a stack of fuel in your engine, not just on the ground, is, hours. Delivering that same stack of fuel to that location, that could take you weeks. So they work on two very different timescales. You've got the operational loop moving very, very quickly in the middle, and then this long logistical cycle that's going on the outside. And what you've got to do as you're designing your games, you need to have this sort of like weird gearing where the two actually kind of synchronize with each other in a way that's meaningful. This is a challenge, and is often a challenge in terms of doing things. How do you make the operations mesh well with the logistics aspects of things? The next thing I'd like to sort of touch on is what it is that you need to represent. And what I mean by that is, essentially it's answering the question, how many things do you need to see? A lot of logisticians will walk in as you're doing your preliminary meetings to talk about the game design, and they will hand you this long laundry list of everything that they do. Anyone who's ever looked at the FIDIP, which is not the FIDIP, the TIPFID, this time phase force deployment data, it is this massive thousands and thousands of lines long sheet of things where they talk about, 7 pallets of cookies and 2 pallets of toilet paper, and just incredible detail associated with them. When you're playing a logistics game, trying to track all that, it's a nightmare. And I would argue that basically you really, really, really shouldn't do it. From my experience in running logistics games, tracking 8 items is a lot of work. It means a lot of overhead in terms of what you're doing, and it's a lot of variables for the players to sort of manage within their mindset as they're thinking about what it is that they're trying to accomplish. Trying to keep more than 8 things in their head, it's too much, and it just becomes a blur. So if you're sitting there talking about going, okay, well, what if there's only one thing I want to talk about? I just want to know, do I have fuel? Do I have ammo? Do I have food? Probably want to concentrate, instead of the food or fuel, just say like, well, are you in or out of supply? Are you near a railhead so food can get you? There was a great game that was built by Avalon Hill back in, gosh, it must have been the 70s, called Russian Campaign. And the idea was that when you did it, your units, you were the German army invading Russia in World War II. And for the German army, you had to be a certain distance from a rail line. And if that rail line, you could trace that back to the to the western edge, well, then you were in supply. Well, it's a very tidy sort of way to put the supply aspects in, because it made the German player had to manage their control of these rail lines. And the Russian player could sort of mess with that by putting up partisans or doing looping areas and cutting things off. And that had real consequences in terms of the unit's ability to operate. Sometimes it would make it easier for them to be destroyed. They would have to retreat, or sometimes they would simply be eliminated. So putting those things in there, there can be some very simple mechanisms that you can use to that. If there are only a few things that you're doing, so there's some real aggregation going on. So they may talk about fuel as a big, broad category without needing to talk about the specific details of things. You can organize it into a couple, 3 categories. You can see this phenomenon in a game called Race for the Rhine, where there essentially are 3 types of things. There's ammo, fuel, and dry goods, I think, or something like that. And the idea is that every turn you consume a unit of dry goods and a unit of fuel. And when you do combat, you consume a unit of fuel and a unit of ammo. And so that's kind of a neat idea. And the idea is then you sort of have to make sure you build this sort of train of supplies going out forward, and you can kind of move that along, and that sort of gets you the feel of what it is you're trying to do and balancing things out. You can't take just fuel. You can't take just ammo. You got to take a little bit of everything. You can also look at it in this aspect when you're doing things like this, where you should kind of group things by things that have commonalities to them. Things like stuff that needs refrigeration. Both food and blood need refrigeration. Vaccines or medicines, they all need to be refrigerated in order for them to remain fresh and viable when they're at the front areas of operations. Similarly, you can imagine doing something like hazardous handling. If you're doing like things that go boom when you drop it, like ammunition and bombs and other ordnance, well, that can be handled in the same mode as if you're managing eggs, because they can't really be dropped because they'll break. Similarly, you can talk about things that they're heavy lift, whether it's major repair parts like tank chassis or aircraft motors or concrete barriers. All those things can be kind of grouped in the same thing, and then you can require different aspects of your transportation system. So, for example, you can't just take a unit of heavy lift and stick that on top of a VW bug. It's going to get crushed by doing that. You may be able to put something that requires hazardous handling in the VW bug, so they can actually get some real differences in how you do those kinds of things. Invariably, when you're doing a game that is about logistics, you tend to end up with things where basically there are a lot of things that they want to track. They want to look at sort of all phases of combat, so whether that's air warfare, submarine warfare, strike warfare. They want to talk about different kinds of fuels, so there can be real differences between the fuel that you're going to be using for land units versus fuel that you're going to be using for surface units, maritime surface units, for example. And one way to sort of do that is then to sort of look at things and say like, okay, well, are there things that are bellwethers? Are there objects within the things that they're talking about which are really representative of a whole class of other objects? So for example, you could say, well, we're tracking AMRAAMs, but that could be used as a sort of iconic representation of all the elements of air warfare: flares, chaff, missiles, all this other stuff in there. And it can all kind of go along with it. So it isn't just moving a pallet of missiles, it's moving the pallet of missiles and the chaff and the other things like that. So you can sort of use that as a way to sort of talk about the cube and the square that's required for moving the AMRAAM. It's not just the missiles, it's everything else that goes along with that. I think that the question is, they sort of keep kind of plugging things into that, is you need to ask about, well, do the details really matter? So for example, one detail that always comes up in a lot of the games that I've worked on is, why can't we just talk about fuel? Jet fuel versus, maritime diesel fuel. And the answer is that there actually are a lot of differences within the aviation fuel aspect that are important to track as independent things. So JP8, which is sort of standard mil-spec fuel, and which is what most Air Force jets use. In fact, I think all Air Force jets use. It's also what tanks use to drive their engines. Most military vehicles moving around the ground, they use JP8. However, that fuel is not allowed to be used on naval aviation when it's aboard the ship. And the reason is JP8 doesn't have a high enough flash point. So it actually is a fire hazard aboard both the ships. So to that end, there comes a whole other fuel called JP5. JP5 has higher flash point, and it's different than JP8, and there's no way to convert JP8 into JP5. So JP5 is often called the universal donor fuel because anybody can use it, which can be a very fascinating moment when someone starts talking about sort of how, well, gee, we've run out of JP5. Why can't you use just JP8? And there are a lot of debates that go on in games where you start seeing the naval community start getting a little twitchy and a little bit upset because the ground and air community are saying to them, well, come on, guys, in a pinch, we know you'd use it. And the answer is probably they wouldn't actually use it. So some of the details can really matter. Another detail that's very important that comes up in this aspect is Jet A1, which is the standard commercial aviation fuel that's available down in Dulles or any other major airport, can be converted into JP8 using what are called additives. There are three primary ones that go into. The primary one is it's an icing inhibitor called Fizzy. The issue is not so much whether or not there's enough of that additive to convert from one to the other, but do you have enough of the additives in the right places and spots? It's about a 1 to 100 conversion rate. So for every 100 of Jet A1, you need 1 unit of Physio. I think I have that right. That means that although you don't need as much, you still need tankers. They're just smaller tankers of it. And you still got to send all those tankers all the various places that you need. So some of the details can be very important. Some of the details, maybe not so much. So when you're talking about land combat in, say, the European theater of operations, you probably really don't need to carry much of the detail between the various different kinds of jet fuel, because it's all going to be ground-based to start with, except for maybe some stuff that may be afloat, in which case you may need to monitor that. So moving on to the next thing. How granular do you have to be? Invariably, logisticians really, really want lots and lots of precision. They want to talk about that they know exactly how much there is of a particular quantity in every place. They got their RFID tags and that they're kind of moving those things around. I would argue that that is, one, not true, but also not especially interesting when you're doing the game. You don't really need to talk about whether or not you have 1 gallon over here. Usually you're talking about millions and millions of gallons in a particular place. So in general, what you're trying to do is you're trying to look for what is the minimum expenditure that you're going to be talking about for a particular commodity over the period of your game turn. For example, the example I pull up here is that the squadron that's doing a turn that's a week long, where the squadron's primary mission is doing air combat, air-to-air combat, they're going to use more than 1 missile. So sitting there and tracking them at the level of 1 missile at a time is a waste of everyone's time. It's far more interesting to say, like, okay, well, I expect that over the course of the week, each jet will fly 3 sorties, and in the process of each sortie, they'll probably expend their entire racks of air-to-air missiles. Let's say they've got 6 missiles on an aircraft. So we got 12 aircraft in the squadron. So 12 times 3 times 6. And now you're starting to talk about the unit of measure that's actually you need to represent within the game. A brief sort of excursion here. There's always this sort of debate, and as a scientist, I always kind of perk up on this. It's the idea of accuracy versus precision. The two terms are often used, as replacements for each other, but as a scientist, they aren't. They're really radically different concepts. Accuracy is about whether or not you are correct, whether or not you have the right idea of things. So for example, let's say that I'm 6 feet tall. That is accurate. It's not precise, but it's accurate. It is precise to say that I'm 2.573927 kilometers tall, but that's wildly inaccurate. So it's very precise, but very inaccurate. So as you're doing your game design, it's important to not get caught up in the idea of having precision being what drives what you're doing. One, because it's a nightmare to sort of monitor everything at very detailed levels, but also it's also false. I mean, the idea to say that you can actually tell exactly how many gallons are in a particular tank, that's not true. It's especially useless if you're talking about an entire tank farm. So the idea is you want to kind of abstract things down, saying like, okay, what I have here is I've got 100 tanks and each of them has 1 unit of fuel. That's an interesting thing to start dealing with at that point. The other aspect of this is what, as an astronomer, I would talk about sort of the resolution. And that is, you generally want to have your resolution, how much precision, if you will, a little bit higher than than what it is you expect the resolution to be. Let me give you an example. You have, say, a tanker that's out there, and the tanker is going to carry, we'll make it easy for the math I'm about to do, say it carries 99 million gallons, okay? You could represent that with a single counter and say like, okay, my unit of measure is 99 million gallons, and yay, or we'll call it, we'll call it 100 million gallons just for ease of practice. However, someone will come along and say, well, wait a minute. Within this tanker, there actually are 3 separate tanks that I can do different quantities on. So I actually need to have each, like my quantity shouldn't be a million or 100 million, it should be a third of that. So maybe it's 33 million in each one of those. The difficulty is if you ever get down into any partials of that, you're going to have a real hard time dividing things up, particularly when you're doing the execution of the game. You can't really slice your little counter into 3 pieces or smaller pieces when you're in there. When someone says, well, I only want to load each of the tanks in the tanker at half level. General rule of thumb that I've applied from my days, drawing from my time when I was a research astronomer, long ago and far away, is to say that you want a resolution that's about 3 times bigger than what you expect to be using all the time. So that would mean that for my tanker, with its 3 different tanks, I would have essentially my unit of fuel being 1/3 of each of those tanks, or about 1,100, was it 11, I forgot the units I was talking about, 11 million gallons, I think was for each one of them. And so that allows me some abilities to say like, okay, well, you got a partials here, and to do some breaking things up. Going much below that, I'm not sure there's a lot of interest and value into it. I mean, yes, you can do it, but you're gonna end up spending all of your time doing bookkeeping, and that's not a lot of value to that. Along the same lines is trying to walk the line between what is familiar and what is simple. Simple is much better, to be clear, but you're gonna have to deal with what they're familiar with. So for example, the issue of barrels, gallons, and pounds. The tanker community talks about the capacity of their tankers in terms of barrels of fuel, barrels of oil, whatever it might be. The land community that is actually receiving that oil and then has trucks driving things around, they talk about things in terms of gallons. So they're saying like, okay, how many gallons are in that truck? How many gallons are in this tank? Those sorts of things. How many gallons per minute can I pull up off the shore through my pipeline? The aviation community that's actually going to take it, put on the airplanes and fly it around, they talk about it in terms of pounds. Sitting there during a game and trying to convert back and forth between all these various units of measure you'll want to drive a spike through your forehead after about 10 minutes of this. So the idea is this: during your design and development phase, you pick a single game unit. Doesn't matter what it is, but it's got to be something that you can sit there and stick to and not have to do too much of the math about. What you want to do then is basically do all the math for them in advance, because you don't want them sitting going, okay, I got to divide this number by 6.8 to go from pounds to gallons. Don't want to do that. You want to have everything moved out so everyone is thinking in terms of game units, game blocks, these little things that they can move around, and not worry about the details of whether or not have you got the burn rate on an F-35 exactly right, but whether or not you've actually got the right sense of things. There's a lot of times where people say, well, it needs to be richer, it needs to have more depth to it. That's wrong. Adding more complexity to a game is a good way to end up with an unplayable game. And that is neither valuable to the players or you, nor is it a desirable thing to take in and hand to your sponsor when you're actually finishing things up and delivering the game to be played. So the manipulables. These are the things you actually hold in your hand and stuff you move around on the board. These are a key aspect of games, particularly in logistics games. There is at times a real penchant to try to turn everything into an Excel spreadsheet. And I would argue that is exceptionally uninteresting and boring to do that. And here's why. As a player is standing next to a table and they're looking around, they're seeing where fuel is. They see little stacks of things. There's a pile of JP5 over here. There's a stack of AMRAAMs over there. They have a very direct feel of what's going on. And this then helps them to immerse in the game. It helps them sort of basically become part of the process and really move into it and really maintain their situational awareness of what's going on around them. It also starts to help avoid the situations where they go like, oh, I didn't realize that I was out of fuel over there. Well, yeah, you're out of fuel because there's nothing there, see? It also helps to a lot of players, and it's been my experience that this is even stronger with military officers. They're very kinesthetic learners. They learn by doing, by acting and moving on things. As I used to joke with my students in astronomy when we did kinesthetic experiments, we're going to do learning by dance. So the idea is that we want something that will really pull the players in. And having the manipulables, blocks of fuel or tactile things that they can pick up and touch and move around, really helps them sort of feel the process of the game and become part of it. I would also argue that making your logistics objects simple and generic is far better. They'll simplify your setup. So instead of having things labeled with very pretty labels and very specific stuff, just say like, okay, here's a Lego block. That means this. The players will very quickly pick that up. It also helps to, by having simple and generic, it helps to diffuse all the haggling where someone says, well, this block is slightly different from that block in these particular ways, and let me explain why. It also is very valuable, and this came up in I think we were talking about this is one of the tactics design course that Sebastian and I ran. It helps you to avoid theft, or if theft happens, to not be so bent around the axle about it. First game I ever designed, basically I actually labeled each ship. So I can say like, okay, that is, the McCain. I actually had the individual ship labeled. What I started noticing was that the ships were missing. Like at the end of the day, I go, where'd they go? What was happening is players were pocketing them. They thought it was really cool, neat. They enjoyed the game. They wanted to take a memento with them, so they took the ships that they had first sailed on when they were ensigns, which meant that I had all these holes in my set. So I had to go back, and after every game, I had to rebuild the set from zero almost. Have them be more generic and just being like a destroyer or a jet aircraft makes things a lot simpler, because then you don't have one, they're just, well, it's a marker of an F-35. Got it, don't need to worry about that. It's not, there's no real cachet to them. Using color can be a challenge because, there's a fairly high percentage of men, myself included, who are at the very least tint blind, if not actually color blind. So you got to be a little careful how you do the color, but it can be very provocative in terms of having people go like, okay, the black cubes that's diesel, and the purple cubes, that's JP5, and the red, having things where they can sit there and be evocative of what it is that they're like, that can be very valuable to implement. Denominations, the most difficult thing to grapple with denominations, so 1, 3, 5s and things like that, is if you have a huge dynamic range. If on the one hand you're showing, and you need to be able to see the fuel consumption of a fairly small unit, say half a squadron of helicopters, for example, or a detachment of helicopters aboard a destroyer, that might be another. So there's maybe 2 helicopters on the destroyer. That's one end of your range, and the other end of your range is where you have a tank farm where there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of units of fuel associated with that. Well, one way to solve that is sort of kind of building 2 clusters of resolution. So you got the high-end cluster where you've got maybe, a counter for 1 million, a counter for 100,000, and a counter for 50,000. Then there's another cluster resolution down at the other end where you've got maybe 10s, 20s, and 30s, so that you can basically you may need something to bridge between those two, but you're basically saying like, okay, one group is going to be looking at counters that are very, very big, another group's going to look at counters that are very, very small, and they're usually separable because like, well, this is little and this is big. It is important for a couple of reasons to try to avoid piles. And what I mean by that is what you don't want is just have this huge mound of stuff sitting all over on locations on the table. Because one, they'll spend forever counting it and recounting it and recounting it and recounting it and recounting it. And even more worrisome, someone will invariably turn around and hit it with their elbow and knock it spraying all over the board. And then you've got to basically pull everything back. It can be a real nightmare trying to deal with those things. So things that allow you to sort of reduce the clutter and keep the amount down to a minimum while still letting the players go like, ooh, that's a marker that says 10 million over there. That's a lot of stuff over there. Something that can rapidly help them sort of zoom in on those issues is very important and can be very valuable in your design process. Blurring things, so rounding and making things equal. Invariably, you'll design a game and you will make a choice where you say, you know what, I'm just going to say all 5th generation fighters are the same. In terms of the details of things, they're not. They're wildly not the same. F-18s, the example I have here, F-18s versus F-35s, they have very different ranges, very different fuel burn rates. But unless I'm talking about exactly the consumption of a particular base, in which point that might be interesting, for all intents and purposes, they actually are the same thing. And so going through and saying like, gee, I just need to know whether I'm distributing the fuel and roughly the right amounts of fuel to different positions, that's what you need to be focusing in on. Not whether or not you have exactly the right amount for this kind of unit versus that kind of unit, which are basically kind of, similar. That can be really create a lot of difficulties in terms of your sort of monitoring the process of things. We had a game where basically I said, all 5th generation fighters, all F-35 variants are the same token. I'm going to count them as the same thing. I got 5 people rolling their eyes like, oh, but they're not the same. And the C's are different from the alphas and the bravos. And then when we started playing, they went, you're right. They basically are the same. At the resolution of what we're talking about here, there really isn't a difference between them. Now we can sort of do some cheats to make sure that we get some visibility into it. But for the most part, you actually don't need to watch those kinds of things. So rounding things, saying like, okay, 11 million is actually 10 million, because 10 is a nice, easy number to work with. 11 million, you get some weird math going on there every once in a while, unless you got 11 fingers on your hand. Equating things where you say like, okay, well, I'm going to basically call this entire class of units all the same thing. So I'm going to make all the Arley Burks, all the 3 different variants that are out there right now, they're all going to be the same thing. I'm not going to make any distinction between them. Is that exactly correct? No, it's not. But for the purposes of your game, it may be just fine in the process of what you're doing. And they will not miss out on anything because you've called them the same thing. Data collection. Like it says up here, digital support tools are really neat. I've worked with several of them. And they have a lot of promise and a lot of interesting things that they may offer for the future. However, the main difficulty with them is that they can be really messy and they can end up sort of dragging your game down quite a bit. Is it really important that you're able to actually construct an exact replica of play from moment to moment to moment to moment? That may be important, but if that isn't what's important is, well, where did you get things from? Maybe you should be just not worrying so much about whether or not you've written down exactly the right number of things, and you should be more concerned with, monitoring the flow of where things are coming from and where they're going to. It's also an interesting possibility to simply put out a bunch of sheets of paper, big butcher sheets that they can put, they've got the Post-it notes that, 3 feet by 5 feet, that they can put on a wall and give them pens. I've watched players actually construct the entire data collection mechanism themselves from the raw materials, just because I put it out there. At the end of the day, all I need to do my data collection is then take down their sheets of paper, fold them up, and stick them in my safe. And I have all the data and information that I need at that point. Now you're probably going to want to take some notes on top of that, but the players can actually do a lot of the work for you because they will tell you what it is that's important to have monitored and kept track of. The other issue that comes up often with digital systems, whether it's Excel or something much more complicated, is you really got to build the hooks in there so that they can replicate the things that humans would do naturally. Something like, well, why didn't the system tell me that I was running low on jet fuel? Or that there wasn't enough. It's like, I flew out here. Well, oh, oops, you didn't have enough fuel. You couldn't have done that. So let's rewind the turn back to that point where you made this decision, and now what are you going to do? A human will look at a pile of things and go like, I need 4 of those, I got 3, can't do it. Okay, got it, and they will have moved on. The digital system is going to need to actually sort of basically present that information, that warning to them that things are going not the way that they would like them to be, so that they can make decisions based upon that. Digital systems they get complex very rapidly, and there's no guarantee that they're actually going to work. I've worked with, I think, 7 different systems at this point, something along those lines. And invariably, there's a point at which they crash. I had a game where one of my data collectors locked himself out of the computer. Wasn't being malicious at all. It just happened to lock himself out. And the outcome was we lost all the data on that system because we could never get back into it. So, there can be some reliability issues as well as some speed issues. If you're sitting there and it takes almost as much time for you to enter the data as it does for them to have thought it, well, that's a lot more time of downtime when the players aren't doing anything. The other part about it is invariably, you've carefully done your design and development, you've built your data collection engine to sort of mate towards that whole process. You get into the execution moment and someone comes up and goes, yeah, that's not actually how things work. They work like this. As a human being, I can go, okay, I can respond and adapt to that fairly quickly. If I turn to my data, my digital system, the programmer has written and said, hi, I'd like you to rewrite the software right now in real time while we wait, they're just going to throw something at me. And it won't be pleasant when it hits me. So I think they can be. I think they offer the possibility of some things. And I've seen some are better than others. I mean, I've seen some really great work that Will Ellerby's done with the Swift data engine. Really cool things that he's been able to accomplish with that. But they can be they need time to develop. They need the room to sort of try them out and sort of debug them and make sure that they're working properly. And there are always unforeseen sort of interactions that occur. So it's important to really test all these things out. So spreadsheeting, it can be interesting, it can be valuable, but you might consider the possibility that you really might not actually need to do that. You might put your time and energy into focusing on what the players are talking about and what they're putting on those boards up in front of them. I'd like to now shift over to the execution process and sort of running the game itself. And I wanted to begin with this first quote up here, which is something that Admiral Swift said at the very beginning of the game that I was running for him out in Hawaii. And it was really, if it would have been socially appropriate, I would have gone up and kissed him, because his one statement, this one sentence at the very beginning as we started to play, unfettered all of my participants in the room. They realized that they weren't going to be put on report if they lost. That in fact, Admiral Swift wanted them to try things out to see what would happen. And this is an incredibly important thing to do. And this loops back to the very beginning when I was talking about sort of us making the case to the command deck about why it is we need to have logistics in the game. You need to have your command general or the flag officer or the SES who's sponsoring this come in and say to them, logistics is important. It's okay if you lose. I want to learn what happens from this, because we want to learn about process. We want to learn about decisions. We want to learn about what creative options and solutions people come up with when their first choice, their primary option, isn't available to them. What do you do when plan A doesn't work? If plan B isn't okay, well, you got a real problem. You need to go back and rethink things. We're trying to get them out there to basically test out assumptions, explore the consequences of their actions, good and bad, to learn like, wow, that had a really good outcome from it, or wow, that was really, really, really bad, and I really don't want to do that, even though the probability of that happening is very low. So, the idea of getting the command deck really behind you and really engaged in the process of a war game, especially in logistics war game, and that logistics are important within the war game, is going to be really key to the process of it. So I think that, my intro where I was talking about, why we should be, making the argument for logistics, that's part of the process of actually creating the successful game, is that you have convinced the command deck that what you're trying to do and what, is of value, and that they then articulate that to the participants that they brought to you to play in the game that you've built. The next part in execution, and again, this draws upon something I talked about earlier, and that is the idea of immersion. When we're running a game, we really want the players to forget that it's a game. We want them to sort of fall into the movie, if you will, and to become part of the whole process of it, so that when they make a statement, when they release that excited utterance, if you will, we can hear what they're actually thinking about the problem. We can have them engaged in the choices and the decisions they're making in a way that's meaningful. If they're just like, yeah, whatever, I don't care if that ship dies, yeah. You want players to be looking and going, yeah, if I lose that ship, it's really bad, and that's going to be on CNN the next day, and you want to hear those things. You want them diving into that, because it's going to be important for them. That's actually what you're trying to mine. You're trying to mine those moments when the players let their emotions get a little bit away from them, so that they're not just kind of standing back at arm's length watching this. They've actually kind of come into the movie and are really listening and really engaging with what you're doing. A really stupid thing that I do, which seems to have a remarkably outsized impact on the possibility of a positive outcome from game, is keeping them as a captive audience. Bring lunch to them. If you sit there and say like, oh yeah, we're going to break for lunch in the middle of the day, you're going to lose about 25% of your total allotted time to just lunch. Because you can say, well, we're going to have an hour for lunch, and invariably someone will leave early because lunch is coming up and I got to go run an errand. So they leave at 11:30. And invariably someone else will come back late because, well, they got stuck in traffic, or the general officer buttonholed them in the passageway to ask them about how the game was going for all. And so instead of a 1 hour lunch, well, now it's a 2 hour lunch. And so out of your 8 hour day, or which is oftentimes a 7 hour day, you've lost 2 hours to basically dead space. That's 25% of your time. Alternatively, if in a game, I did this once, where you have essentially, food's coming in, and at some point in time when it's about lunch, you just start handing them a sandwich. So they're sitting there munching away on their Subway sandwich, if you will, while they're making decisions. You get all that gameplay right there and back. They never pull their head up out of the process, and they remain immersed in it. In addition, letting them do things like roll the dice, giving them agency, letting them move the pieces. You got to watch them, but letting them do it, and letting them do the accounting on things. If you're sitting there, and one of the things you got to do at the end of every turn cycle is count up how much of each thing there is at every location. Well, assign a person to each location. It's their job to count things up. You just sit there recording it all. Now I got 15, 20, 30 people. They're all doing all my data recording for me. It will rapidly accelerate the process of game flow. And that's very important. We want to keep them in the flow of the game as much as is possible. We want them so that they can kind of get there and get into a rhythm of the process of the game and move it along so that they can really advance the play of things. We don't want them sitting there in a meeting, whatever that means, just kind of checking out and sort of burning CPU cycles. That's a waste of everyone's time. Another thing I've had some success with, which I think can be very valuable, is making them be read. You'll hear them a lot of times say, well, I can't play red. And I think that's a false premise. And here's why. First off, the game is not about seeing whether or not they can actually check off the boxes in their job. Nor is it about sort of whether or not they have, their spreadsheet tool is more awesome than anybody else's spreadsheet tool. We're trying to basically interrupt their normal process flow in ways that they hadn't anticipated, and then see what they do. What happens when that tanker that you were counting on gets sunk by an enemy submarine? What happens when the box of additives that you were expecting to arrive at this location turns out to be toilet paper instead of what you had intended it to be? Those are very important things to do, and to kind of make them do that. And having them play red, they're fully prepared to do that kind of things. We just need them to kind of think about things in creative and interesting ways. But this will put someone out of their comfort zone. Hardly anyone, I can attest, is a gamer. And in fact, even a lot of the people who have been to Wargames have not actually been to a real war game, and much less, a lot of times, even if they've been, they haven't participated in one. So when you say to them, I want you to play red, they're going to go like, oh, I don't know how I feel about it. Kind of walk them through it. Explain the process to them. Tell them what you're going at. Tell them that they don't need to be exactly accurate. They just need to be creative and thoughtful about what they're doing, and that they just need to move the process along. They will actually turn out more often than not to be very good red players. I mean, one of the arguments that I always make for my logistician is, who better to attack your system than you? You know exactly where all the weak points are. You know what it is that keeps you up at night. So as red, do that. This is your opportunity to show to your boss that this thing that you keep nugging on about in the staff meetings that's really important is really important. In addition, a lot of people that sometimes get brought into play red, and a lot of times they're from the intel branch, and they're really smart about the adversary, and they do some interesting sort of operational kinds of things. A lot of times they don't know very much at all about logistics. So they sit there and they will pass by the opportunity to shoot a tanker that's about to resupply an aircraft carrier because, well, it's just a tanker, who cares? Well, without that tanker, the aircraft carrier is just a really weird cruise ship tooling around. So the idea that logisticians are unable to play red, I don't think is true. but you're going to need to convince them. You're going to need to sort of walk them through why this is an important thing and tell them why you want them to play red, what it is about their knowledge base that they will bring to the playing of red that is so valuable, because it really is. I think it really will bring important things to what's going on.
Hank, I just had a quick question in the chat.
Sure, please.
It just asked how you deal with the problem of mirror imaging.
What do you mean by mirror imaging?
Not sure. Richard, I don't know if you feel free to unmute and just kind of clarify.
Not hearing you, Richard, if you're broadcasting.
He said basically by playing red as if they're playing blue.
I think that it's certainly a possibility. You know, and I think that it is one of the things you do have to worry about, sort of, you know, assuming that your opponent will do what you think is the most important thing. You know, what you call the high value unit may not be what they call the high value unit. So I think that can be complicated. I think that one of the things that I've done to sort of allay that is create these mixed red teams, or create what's like a wandering subject matter expert. In one game we called it a lifeline. The idea being is that you have a logistician who's playing red, but then there's actually someone from the intel shop who's wandering around who can field questions or point out opportunities that may not have been obvious to the logistician who's playing red or the person who's playing blue. I think that operators tend to be a little bit more, you know, the guys from the 3 shop who actually do ops, you know, current day ops, they tend to be a little bit more vulnerable to what you're calling mirroring than anybody else, because they sort of see the problem through the lens that they're operating, which is, I got these aircraft, this is what they do, and they can be the hardest ones to sort of break out of that mold. Sometimes I think when you're looking at your roster of players, knowing where they came from, you can do some intelligent sort of like, okay, I'm going to put this person over here, and I'm going to make sure that they don't play red. I'm not saying that you should just take anybody to play red. I think you need to thoughtfully craft that and say, like, okay, well, I want the person who is in charge of buying tankers around the world. I want them to play red because she knows exactly how to manipulate the market so that blue can't get the tankers they want. That could bring real valuable expertise. So I think that what the process of this is that you're sitting down with your action officer, and during the design and development, and they're developing the roster of who's going to come. You sit there like, okay, where are they from? Tell me about them. And so start, you know, kind of intelligently colluding with them to sort of build the red and blue teams in a way that will actually get at the problems that you want. And I think that that's some of the ways you can do it. I think that another part about it is that, you know, you as the game designer, you likely, because you kind of climbed out the guts of this game, you can sit there and, you know, you can intervene. You're part of the white cell. You can go and say like, does it seem like you're missing an opportunity by doing this instead of that? And point it out to them. They may argue with you, but if they do argue with you and they pursue it ahead with something you think isn't very valuable, this is something I'm talking about in a second, you get to write the report later. You get to come back and say, red made this choice and left this blue asset, this vulnerable blue asset alone. You should realize, sir, that if red had attacked this blue asset, 1, they would have destroyed it, and 2, that would have had these other consequences associated with that. Part of our job as analysts when we're doing reports and the after action parts of it is to gently, carefully, and with great humility show places where we think there might be weak spots in their assumptions and in their choices. You don't want to put someone on a report. You don't want to pin them up to the wall with, you know, the bug pin. But, you know, letting that go can be, you're not doing your job if you just let it go. I hope that answers your question. And I forgot who that was. So I can't respond to your name. My apologies. But I hope that gets towards what you addressing the issue. I'm going to forge ahead unless there's any more questions or a follow-on to that.
Yeah, I think you're good, Hank. That was
okay.
Said in the chat was excellent.
Okay, great. I'm glad. Okay, God help you if this ever happens to you. It happened to me once, and that was a time that I remember in great detail. You have a player who stands up in the middle of the game and says, "Yeah, I don't buy it. This isn't right. It's not going to. This is wrong." Trying to debate them is a waste of time, especially about logistics. Invariably, in a war game about logistics, you're in a room full of SMEs, subject matter experts, who know far more about the logistics aspects of things that you're talking about than you will ever know. Your forte is game design. That's why you're there, and you're there to sort of help mediate and referee things and keep things moving along. So if you get into a debate with someone, one, you're not going to win. Their mind will not be changed, and everyone else will have checked out. So as an alternative in these sorts of situations, give way. If someone says, I demand that I have as many tankers as I want, you may think, as I did at one point in time, that that's a completely unrealistic thing for them to demand. And you can say that as your opening bid. It's like, well, I don't think that that's realistic. When I said that to one player, they became literally unglued. They just, literally hit the ceiling tiles. In that moment, you have to be very, very careful, because this is one of those where you kind of got to be a little split-brained about things. On the one hand, there's your exterior, where you're trying to deal with this person who may be kind of obstreperous, and you're trying to deal with them in a constructive and positive way that doesn't, make anybody angry or things like, you kind of be, let's all be friends, let's all get along. At the same time, there's got to be another voice in your head that's got to be saying, why is this person so upset? What is it about this that is so unsettling to them that they've gotten so emotional about it? I've done a good job. They're immersed. Good for me. I've also done a good job in that I've gotten them to a point where I've actually touched on a nerve. But I've hit a nerve. I need to now understand about that. Why is it that this is this way? Let's talk about that. It may not be in that moment, but you need to come back to that. In the one specific instance that I was talking about, about the guy saying that they wanted as many tankers as they could have. When it was clear that he was very angry if I didn't give him all the tankers, I was like, okay, here you go, take them all, and just let it go. And I came back maybe about a day later, and I sat down and said, I'd be really curious to understand more about this. Tell me about what you know, and let's talk about it. We had an incredibly interesting and productive conversation. Went on for about an hour after the day was over. And he told me all about sort of the tanker market, and I learned a huge amount of stuff that I was then able to fold back into my analysis of the report afterwards. So when you hit those nerves, be patient. They're upset. They're angry. They're very emotional about it. Don't just sit there and say, well, the rule book says, and like it or lump it. Bad choice. Say like, okay, let's fix the rule book. Tell me why. Let's talk about it some more. Let's keep engaged in them. I want to learn. I want to know about things. You've gotten the excited utterance. Congratulations. Now you need to sort of really explore that part about it. And like I said before, remember, you get to write the report later. So if the person hands you a complete line of BS about something, and you're sitting there going like, as you're writing all this down, and you're thinking, yeah, not buying it. Really not buying it. This is complete, sure. Outside of this one geographic line, fuel tankers become made of adamantium and are complete, vibranium, and they can't be shot. Yeah, sure, whatever. And what is it that prevents the thing that could shoot them from going, 2 centimeters outside the line? Yeah, I don't buy it. You can come back later, and again, carefully, talk about what it is you think might be the weaknesses in the argument that they've made. That if say the adversary were able to conduct a slightly larger out-of-area deployment with their submarines, suddenly an area that Blue had assumed would be risk-free can be put at risk. And you can say like, the problem with that may be is then the effects of that are as follows, and you can lay out that argument. You don't get to be the one who decides whether or not that's something that they're going to act upon. That's going to be up to the flag officer. But that is your job to sort of bring it to their attention, saying like, the players are, the participants assumed this thing. And here may be the weaknesses in that assumption. And here are then the consequences if those assumptions are incorrect. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'd like to finish off then by talking about the future. There is a real weakness sometimes within the community that we work for in designing games, where their vision of a war game is, you know, it's 50 people in a room for 5 days playing a scenario. The problem with that is that it's a once-off. You only get one time at it. And even if it's done really, really well, which a lot of times, unfortunately, they aren't, which is too bad, someone can make the argument, whether it's true or not, that the results and the outcome of the game were dependent upon gameisms. Oh, Timmy rolled a 6 at this point in time, and that was the, you know, everything fell apart from there. And that's a gameism, because you're not always going to roll a 6, you're going to roll a 3 sometimes. You're right. That's true. I don't think that's completely valid, because you're basically saying, well, yeah, but 16% of the time, I'm going to roll a 6. So are you okay with, you know, only being safe 85% of the time? You know, is that all right with you? That's a little bit of a harder argument to make, and you got to be a little bit light on your feet when you're talking about those kinds of things. As an alternative, though, I would suggest this, and that is kind of borrowing from what my colleague Jim Lacey at the Marine Corps University, he's also at IDA as well, too, teaches wargaming there. He said the other day, and I've gotten this quote secondhand, so I apologize if I'm abusing it slightly, but the sense of it was the idea of moving to sets and reps. You know, we look at, you know, we've all, or many of us, have read Peter's book, you know, The Art of Wargaming. And Peter talks in great detail and with great enthusiasm, as he should, about the 20s and 30s at the Naval War College and the gaming that was done there amongst the cadets and what they learned and how they went about things and the instructors and the process. And it was a really rich sort of time for wargaming that occurred there. The idea is that when the cadets played a game, they didn't just play it once. They played it over and over and over and over and over and over again, many times, and they played many variations of the game. So the idea is that you create this entire library where you can sit there and say, like, gee, we've played 100 games. And in those 100 games, aircraft carriers had a conclusive and decisive contribution to make 70% of the time. That's interesting. If you just had it once where they won, you can like, well, maybe they're good, maybe they're not, I'm not sure. So how do you do that? How do you get to the sets and reps? How do you get to where the numbers of things are high? Two approaches, you can join them together. The first is kind of tournament style. Go in and instead of running a game, run 8 games or 10 games all at the same time. You're gonna have multiple tables going, small teams, they'll be a little bit more nimble and make their decision cycles shorter, but have them play the game many, many, many times just by the sheer fact of having many tables out there. This can be a little bit harder in execution, and I don't claim to have all the end-all be-all on how to do this. It can be quite challenging, and you're going to need a fairly large staff of people to support you in the process, because you can't be everywhere all the time. You're going to need a lot of people who have played the game and understand how to do things, and you can kind of flit around adjudicating the higher level things, but you as the game designer are probably going to be flying Overwatch over top of them and sort of backstopping them as they're sort of resolving issues as they're doing things. But doing that kind of thing can actually give you a lot of insight to like, gee, in this scenario that we played 10 or 12 times, the same theme happened over and over and over again. And it seemed to have the same positive or negative outcome. That can have a real potency to it. The other part about this is that the idea of doing sets and reps opens the door to applying the concept of the design of experiments. And this is borrowed from statistics and I would say practical mathematics, but I'm abusing the term there, my apologies. The idea is that instead of doing a factorial exploration of the design space, like every sort of permutation and combination of game element that you might be considered on, and having to do 3 or 4 games of each one of those to understand what's going on, you can actually do a much more rarefied exploration of that sort of phase space to understand, like, going, okay, well, what are the effects of these 3 games had this one capability, and these 3 games had a different one. And then we shifted in these like this. So you can kind of explore the space that you're interested in sort of understanding in a much more reduced fashion. And thus, the idea of having to do 10 to the 12th or 10 to the 15th games, that goes away. You can reduce that down to a much more reduced number. You may only still be able to do sort of primary effects like this was better than that, but you can actually start to see some visibility into things that you might not be able to do if it was just a single outing. I'm just at the very beginning of sort of exploring this possibility. Doing a design of experiment. And how do you implement that? How do you make that go forward? I think there really is. I think this has got something to it. If only because it brings back the idea of what we did in the Naval War at the Naval War College in the interwar years. With that, I thank you all for your attention, and I will happily say and take as many questions as you guys can throw at me, and hopefully I can come up with some really good answers. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Hank. I appreciate it. I think I'm echoing the sentiment of, we had just around 60 participants saying it really was interesting and helpful. We actually had a few questions that we kind of saved to the end that I've just got in order. So if anyone else has more questions, feel free to toss them in the chat. I'll kind of add it to the queue. But the first one we had from David was, if you've ever run an event at a wargaming convention, and if so, could you tell us about just kind of any interesting outcomes you've had?
Sort of. I've never done one at a convention, but I have done within a large gaming group. And I did run a game where I had 8 tables running simultaneously in a professional game. They're fascinating exercises in chaos. Managing a herd of cats would be far easier. The difficulty is that a lot of times, particularly in large group settings, like in a tournament kind of mode, there's a wide dispersion in familiarity with the rules, as well as even in the parts that they are familiar with, their interpretation of those rules. So a lot of times what happens is you're over on one side of the room, and the other side of the room is debating this fine point of what something means. They come to resolution, move on ahead. You walk back, never knew the argument or the dispute had happened. And now they're doing some weird stuff. You're like, what are you guys doing over here? That can't fly. What are you talking about? So I think that in terms of running large format groups, where you're running a tournament for all intents and purposes, the really key aspect of that is to having a lot of game assistants, game directors, although theoretically there's only one game director, whatever. But people who can talk knowledgeably to the players about the mechanisms and the methodology of the game, so that they can make intelligent and not that their decisions and resolutions aren't too ad hoc. I mean, that's the real problem, right? Is that someone over on the other side of the room decides that this pig can fly because it says PIG does this rate. Well, you meant something else by PIG. Well, now they got flying pigs all over the place. You're going, well, guys, that doesn't make any sense. Come on. Because like I said, if you're the designer, a lot of times you can't be everywhere all at once. And even running a single game where there's 50 people, little knots will break off and sort of decide things on their own where you just can't be in there. And I got to tell you, after running a single game for 5 days, you're exhausted. All you want to do is lay down with a bottle of tequila and hope some of it goes in your mouth. So anyways.
Well, thank you for that and for that image. We had 2 questions that kind of had some overlap by James and Nathaniel. And James had asked, what kind of existing wargame logistics model do you wish you had designed, and why?
Oh, wow. Well, clearly all of my designs are the best ones I've ever seen. But seriously, I think that some of the emerging games that I find really fascinating are things like Terraforming Mars, which is a very interesting sort of Euro-style competition game. I think that has a really interesting possibility of how you do things with logistics and the sort of game mechanism methodology. There's a really interesting game called Churchill, which is a three-handed game, which is really complicated and almost impossible to tell whether you're winning or not until you actually count up the points at the very end. But there's a whole aspect of sort of how do you manage your players and things like that. It's a very intriguing sort of way that they've built the way for the players to interact and the resources that they have and how they apply them. There are the old standbys, like Agricola, which is intriguing. Although I find that a little bit at times it's not that much fun to play with other people because I keep going, why are you doing that? That's insane. You're crazy. Don't do that. I think that there are lots of different mechanisms out there, and I think that the one thing that I've always said with any games is that game designers they steal from each other all the time. And they borrow from different mechanisms and methodologies and adapt them to their purposes. And I would argue that imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, right? If you find a mechanism out there that someone else has built, that's a really cool, borrow it, try to adapt it to your purposes. The person should feel pretty good that they were so smart that they came up with something like that. And to be honest, I have to say that the mechanisms that I've come up with, I might say that they're novel, but they're also sometimes they can be reduced very simply down to one thing. I had one action officer look at my game after I finished designing it, and he went, "Oh, hey, it shoots and ladders. Cool, I got it." So, your best efforts to be really creative and innovative. Sometimes you're just borrowing something that you played when you were 5. So, yeah, in terms of stuff that I would recommend in terms of logistics types games to play, Terraforming Mars, really cool game. I would highly recommend that. I would recommend the Cities and Knights variant of Settlers of Catan, not the base version. That's a lot more interesting as far as I'm concerned. Other logistics games that are out there. Most of the real games about logistics are the ones that are more the Euro style games, where the competition based things, where you're not trying to kill the other person, you're just trying to outcompete them. There's what's it called? It's a game about natural selection. It's called I'm blanking on it. It'll come to me, or I'll turn around and look at my game shelf behind me. Maybe you can see it over my shoulder. But there's some really interesting things that are out there that are that you can do sort of, particularly within the Euro style games, that can really be very interesting in terms of logistics aspects of things. In general, when I'm building a logistics game, the combat is a way to create a demand signal. So the combat sometimes is a little bit cartoonish because I don't really care. I just need to have a big hole for fuel over here and a big supply for fuel over there, and how do I get it from here to there? That's what I care about. So movement of things around and the resources. It's rarely about having enough amount of it. So I hope that answers your question, James and Nathaniel. And if you ever want to play Terraforming Mars, let me know.
I had a question. I was kind of talking with Sebastian before this. Over the weekend, we had played Axis and Allies, and it was my first time playing it. And one of the things that Sebastian did pretty early on was just take out all my transports. And so I had, by the end of the game...
No problem.
Yeah, by the end of the game, maybe a solid plan of comeback, but it just wasn't feasible because I logistically just wasn't there. So in games like those that are not necessarily solely about logistics, but are, logistics are a significant part of it, how do you as either a designer or kind of a game facilitator stress the importance of logistics when the game's not necessarily totally centered on them?
Well, I think you've highlighted a very important thing that you can borrow for other games, and that is you can kind of concentrate all your logistics into single points of failure, if you will. And then if the player isn't defending or supporting them adequately, you as their adversary can go and exploit that. Reaching back to what I was saying about the Russian campaign game from years and years and years ago, you have this situation where, you're the German forces and you're pushing across the Russian steppe towards Moscow. Winter's coming, you got to get there, oh my God, and it's going to be bad, and you're getting farther and farther away from your supply lines, and you only have these few rail lines that kind of go out. And, there are specific units that are really good, and you really want to use them up in the front, but you kind of need them actually to be back in the back areas to sort of basically kind of keeping the partisans away from shutting down your rail lines, because if they shut down your rail lines, you're out. Your whole army collapses. So, I think that you can talk about, introducing, like in Axis and Allies, for example, where the transports become a key aspect of what you're doing. You've got all these resources in the United States, right? And so you're buying all these units, but they're sitting there going, well, we can't get across the Atlantic. So, let's know how it works out, guys. The other aspect of it, things like, for Axis and Allies is, invariably one of the strategies in the original version was try to build a production center, have the Japanese build a production center on mainland Asia, right? Because then you could actually produce units there rather than having to move them from Japan proper. Well, then it becomes an whole issue of like, all right, well, if I build it there, but it gets captured by somebody else, well, then they can use it and I can't. And similarly for Britain, they want to build, like in the original, they build one in India. That was always an interesting play. But then can you defend that long enough so that your forces are built up so it actually becomes a bastion? Or does just Japan come down, take it away from you, and then you're really, really, you're really behind the curve at that point. So I think there are interesting ways that you can go about giving players, the opportunity to make a choice. That's what games are about. I'm going to present you with a situation that is uncomfortable, and I'm going to give you two choices. If I'm really good, neither of them is your first choice, but I'm going to give you a second, a B and a B prime, and I'm going to see which one you pick. And once you've picked it, now I'm going to make you live with the consequences of that. So I'm going to make it so that you can't just be like, oh, well, oops, let's rewind back to when I screwed up so I can start over again. No, you got to keep going this way. You can make it so that they're in the situation where they have to, like I said, live the dream that they've constructed for themselves. So that's a really important part, particularly about professional war games. In an entertainment game, I build my IPC, my Industrial Production Center, for those who aren't Axis and Allies aficionados. I can build my IPC down in India as Britain. And you capture it and I go, damn, okay, well, I concede the game, let's start over. And you rack up a win on your chart. We set things up again. And I go, all right, well, do I build it there this time? Or, I can judge whether or not I thought that was a lucky die roll on your part. But there are ways to adjudicate. In a professional setting, that was almost a useless exercise, right? I basically went, oh, darn, I don't like how reality turned out. Well, I'm going to try a different, no. You actually want to see how things play out. So I hope that answers your question.
It did, yeah, thank you. And maybe it's good we're not all living in Sebastian's world, because I love to hear
Yeah, I don't know. I think Sebastian and I would be, we would be a fearsome duet if we were playing in some of the games that I've built. One of these, I'm actually to be able to play red against the blue officers. I think I could make them cry. But
and as someone who has been stomped by Sebastian many times, I'd love to see that.
Failure is a great teacher, Grant. Just remember that.
The best games are the ones you lose.
Well, yeah, so I'll give an extra minute just in case anyone else has last questions, because I think,
sure.
Let me know otherwise if I think we've exhausted all the ones. Oh, we just got one from Evan. Evan D'Alessandro, who asked, what do you think is the minimum level of granularity that is more conventionally focused war games should represent logistics?
Your signal blurred there for a second. Let me repeat that back. What do I think is the minimum level of granularity for more conventional war games to have?
More conventionally focused war games.
Well, I think that I'm going to give a very unsatisfactory answer to that and say it depends. If you're doing something where you're talking about a tactical game, like I was mentioning earlier before, the Samstrike game that Phil Saban designed, the way he incorporates logistics into that is simply by saying, here's a finite amount of ordnance. Before you start your strike, you have to divide it up amongst the aircraft. I'm not going to give you any more, and when you're out, you're out. So there's a point at which, you expend all your air-to-air missiles, of which you didn't have that many to start with. Well, now what? Do you leave the game? Do you fly out? Do you give up? What's going to happen there? Similarly for like an anti-radiation missile, a HARM one, where, you're launching it at a ground station. Well, okay, I only got 3 of these. So if the first 2 miss, maybe I'm not just popping those off every time at something. I'm going to wait until I actually really have a target that really is of value for me to shoot at. So it can be very simple. I mean, it could be something where you have like a very, a small thing where you're just limiting their magazine size. Like I said, for a Russian campaign, it can be simply that at the end of every turn, you have to make sure that you're near a rail line, or that a rail line is this far away, or that a city is this far away. Because if you're not, then you're out of supply, and then the consequences of that. They do something similar in Paths of Glory, which is a World War I strategy game. Really great game. But you, in the last half of each turn, there's this sort of like moment where you really have to be careful to pay attention that suddenly you don't let your opponent sort of zip around and cut off an entire front's worth of armies, because then they all just die and the whole game collapses on you. So there can be very simple mechanisms to implementing logistics in more standard games. I mean, even if you're playing like a Wild West cowboy game, simply implementing the fact that you have to reload, right? You get 6 shots, and at the end of 6 shots, you must take some time to stop and reload. And oh, by the way, you only have this many reloads. That can be a very important and interesting way to implement a logistical constraint on the process of things. You could do things like saying, you have this much energy, and as soon as you expend all that energy, well, you got to stop and rest for a little while until you build your energy back up, and then you can kind of keep going. So there's lots of different ways to go about it. A really cool way that was done years ago in the Panzer General series was they had, when you got near the end, you had the opportunity as a German player to buy, I can't remember, it was like a King Tiger, I think it was. And they were great. They just would blow up everything in its path, and they were unstoppable. So once you got there, it was like, why don't I have all of them? Well, the answer was that what they put in play was that the King Tiger had a really reduced rate of speed and a smaller magazine. And what that was to sort of, and they actually talked about in the design notes, they said, this is to show the effect of the fact that because they've been rushed out of production in Germany, there were still a lot of problems with the mechanical chassis. And so they were always breaking down. They always had to do repair work on it. And so they couldn't drive very far before they had to stop, fix a tread, or replace an air filter, or do something else. So they had to wait for the parts to arrive. So although they were incredibly efficient in combat and really desirable, they couldn't get to the combat a lot of times. So there was a drawback. So really simple things like that, just like saying, okay, well, this tank, which you got 2 tanks and one's going 10 hexes in a turn, and the other one, well, yeah, it should be able to drive that distance, but it's going to break down. So I'm only going to let it go 2 or 3. You can do really simple things like that to implement logistics into the process of stuff. I hope that answers your question, Evan. I was a little vague about how to do it, but I hope that kind of gives you some hook into it.
Hey, Hank.
Yes.
This is Chris Weave.
Hey, Chris.
So, hello. So you were talking about an evolution game. Was it Dominant Species by GMT?
Yes. Thank you. That's exactly the one.
Yeah. So Dominant Species, for those who haven't seen it, if you take a straight stick 1980s, 1990s war game designer and describe a Euro game to him, but don't actually let him see one, this is what he'll produce.
There you go. Fair enough. Fair enough.
It's a great game.
It is a fun game. It's interesting watching all your species suddenly die at the critical moments and how you score points. So it's one of those games where you have to be very careful not to fall in love with your avatars and realize that the main goal of the game is to score points. And if the avatars all die, but you score a lot of points, that's a good thing. So.
Hank, I know someone had asked if it was possible to shoot you an email. Do you have a contact address?
Actually, yes, it's on the cover slide at the very beginning. It is R. Donnell. I don't get a last letter in my name because we only get to use 8 characters. It's rdonnell at ida.org.
Great, thank you. I just tossed it in the chat, so if you do want to talk to Donnelly an email,
Sure.
the email address is there. Tom, I know you said you maybe had a question. Feel free to hop up the mic and ask.
You may still be on mute, Tom. I can't hear you.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself, Tom. Yeah.
All right.
There you go. Great.
Now? All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Sir, I had some real quick and easy way to add logistics to any game to tack on. It doesn't matter the mechanics you're playing. This is a standalone thing. And it was written up in M1, number 94, back in July of August 98, pages 122 and 123.
Wow. Okay.
And it's the name of the article is misleading. It says the command status stand, but as an example of how to use it, I came up with this idea of taking a bunch of number 8 washers and spray painting half of them any color you want, and leave the others plain whatever color they came as. One is for fuel, and the other's for ammo, your choice. At the beginning of the game, you set out the parameters of the objectives of the game, and you go to the Supreme Commander and give him a handful of ammo and a handful of fuel. And he can transport them and make distribution as he sees fit. Only 5 washers to a truck. And you let them figure out how they're going to use it. And this was actually tried at Historicon that year by Chris von Bonnestock at Outland Games with Micro Armor. And the object is you want to have your mad minute. You can fire off all the ammunition that you have, or you can move to your heart's content for as much fuel as you have. But when you're out of fuel, you've got to get it resupplied somehow. And this presents a challenge to all the players and to the overall commander, because he has to worry about getting forward pushed supply dumps, forward geographically located dumps, and to be able to have the transportation to move them as needed. Now, we didn't care what kind of ammunition it was. It was ammunition washer. And fuel, it was obviously the right kind of fuel for whatever you're trying to move. And the rules were, if you moved just 1 iota, just change facing of a vehicle, then it cost you a whole chip. You could move everybody in that unit with the cost of 1 chip. Same way with firing. If you just wanted to fire off a 45 at a bird or something, it cost you a chip. Or everybody could fire everything that they had for 1 chip. And it was really surprising because in the actual playing of the game, they were playing a Battle of the Bulge sort of scenario, and the Americans were advancing. And they ran out of fuel. So they sent a truck. Now they had like 25 extra trucks. They sent a truck worth of fuel, and a stug took out the truck. And for the rest of the game, that effort was stymied because they were afraid to send more fuel or figure out a tactical method to get fuel to those guys. And they ended up losing the game. So it's a very simple mechanic that can be grafted onto really any game, because you can find 1 or 2 things that are logistically, good golly, water. People don't really understand how heavy water is.
Armies move on water. That's what they move on.
Absolutely. And I did.
No, that's a fascinating approach to things. I mean, one of the things that I've thought about doing with particular things is using Legos. That they're very nice is, one, they're everywhere. So you can go down the local Lego store and pick up a bunch of them. They come in lots of different sizes and lots of denominations, if you will. And you can plug them together so you can make these sort of coherent masses of things that don't end up sort of walking around all over the place. So they and they come in a whole bunch of different colors. So you sit there and make a whole sort of array of things, kind of lock them together, and it will unlock the child in all of your participants too, which was a good thing. So yeah, but that's a really cool idea. I mean, the idea of giving them a simple mechanism that forces them to make decisions and to be constrained. I mean, that's the real problem a lot of times in professional war games, right?
Right. I have
that are built without, that are built without logistics. Is they have a situation in which, you know, you're sitting there, and I've watched, you know, a destroyer in a game launch off, you know, an Arleigh Burke launch off 1,000 tomahawks. You sit and go like, okay, where did they come from? Because it's only got 96 cells in the front of it, and they can't reload at sea. So how did this happen? And then the operational commander's going like, oh, because I did this and this and this, and this, all these great things happen. You're going like, yeah, I don't think so, sir. But it's an important place to, and that's why I think that, you know, having logistics as a critical aspect of constraint on things is a sine qua non for true professional games.
Agreed. I went to Africa 30 times in 4 years with the Akota program, teaching African battalions, staffs to function under the UN peacekeeping skills. And I learned an awful lot from that, primarily from the standpoint of view of you give them actionable intelligence and then measure how long it takes for them to actually act upon the actionable and perishable intelligence, and see what happens. You really don't need to really furnish them a lot of bad information, because until they know how to use the good information, all you're going to do is frustrate them. And this sort of thing, BCTP, or I'm sorry, I murdered that, but that sort of thing is your staffs to understand. And I thank you for allowing me to jump in and pass that along.
No, that's great. I might try that out in my next game design. We go to Home Depot, buy a whole bunch of washers. So.
Oh, please do. Me, I'm a unit cohesion guy. That's where I don't count casualties. I don't count bodies. I count the unit's leadership's ability to maintain control over the men.
Absolutely.
How much the men have faith in their leaders and vice versa. And that's really the crux of what really counts.
Sure.
But thank you for letting me speak, and I'll back
Thank
on.
you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Let's see if I can mute again here.
All right, so I think, barring any very last minute questions, I think we're all good to wrap up. So thank you again, Dr. Donnelly. Really do appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. For anyone who does have maybe questions that pop in their head later, or like to just talk with Dr. Donnelly again, we did drop the email rdonnell@ida.org. In the chat.
If you do send me an email, please let me know that you were in the talk so that I can reference who you were. That would be very valuable to me. That way I won't just be like, some strange person sent me an email and I don't know whether I should respond or not. I don't know. You know, that'd be, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, and I suppose for reference, that's maybe a good transition point. Thank you again for just as a member of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. We appreciate everyone who showed up to our events and mostly kind of remote webinars. We do have on our website, guwargaming.org, a whole slew of upcoming events. And I think, as was mentioned earlier in the chat, this will be on our YouTube channel where we've got all of our other our webinars. So we appreciate everyone coming. Yeah, I think we're good to go. Thank you again, Dr. Donnelly. Really do appreciate it.
My pleasure entirely. Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, to both you and Sebastian. So thanks.
Thank you, Hank.